A ciência convencional considera o Archaeopteryx o ancestral primitivo de todas as aves. Desde que foi encontrado, este fóssil tem despertado a curiosidade e a imaginação de muitos que tentaram explicar a transição evolutiva entre os dinossauros e as aves. Na atualidade, tem-se encontrado vários novos restos de Archaeopteryx em outras partes do mundo. Mas à medida que aumenta a quantidade de amostras a serem estudadas, as evidências de que isso seja realmente assim parecem diminuir.
In the 1800s, 1860s specifically, Darwin had just published Origin of Species, and it was the talk of the town in London. And at the British Museum, Richard Owen had recently acquired a very peculiar fossil. And that fossil was what we now call Archaeopteryx. Richard Owen was the one who named it. Now, Richard Owen was a pretty sharp critic of Darwin, and he argued for something called the archetype, which he believed was a kind of design pattern that was used in the creation of various sorts of creatures. Archaeopteryx was weird because it had a number of characteristics, a combination of these characteristics that was fairly unique. One of those things was it had beautiful flight feathers. We know flight feathers have a certain asymmetry to them, which allows for the air to pass over the feathers most efficiently when things are flying. And the feathers of Archaeopteryx are asymmetric. The feathers in this fossil were preserved so that you could see them, which is another unusual feature. And so it appeared to be a bird. So people assumed at that point that if it's got feathers, it must be a bird. And Owen thought that this was very similar to the archetype because it had a bunch of weird characteristics. One of the weird characteristics it had was fingers. So birds in the modern world generally don't have fingers on their hands. Their finger bones are all fused together, and it supports the wing. So it reduces weight, of course, and it supports all those feathers which form the flying surface of the wing. But with an Archaeopteryx, we had essentially a hand with claws on the wing, which was very unique. The Archaeopteryx also had a long bony tail with multiple vertebral pieces in the tail. That's not something that we see in modern birds either. Most modern birds have either no tail or a very, very tiny little bony bit that holds, again, the muscles and feathers that form the bird tail. But with Archaeopteryx, there was this long bony tail that then held all the feathers on it. The Archaeopteryx also had a full set of teeth. And of course, modern birds, there are no modern birds that have teeth. The Archaeopteryx also didn't have that massive breastbone. So our breastbone is flat and it holds the ribs together. Bird breastbones do the same thing, except they have this massive structure that runs right up the middle of them. Basically, we call it a keeled sternum. And that structure is used to attach muscles. And those muscles are used for flying. So obviously, if the bird's flapping its wings, it needs lots of good muscles to do that, and the muscles need places to attach, and so, ta-da, you have this big, massive keeled sternum. The Archaeopteryx did not have a keeled sternum at all. So the Archaeopteryx was really odd, and Richard Owen thought this thing looks like the archetype that he had imagined, and so he decided to call this Archaeopteryx, the archetypal wing.
Archaeopteryx was first found in Germany in 1861 in the lithographic limestones. And these are very good rocks for preserving details. And this bird had feathers. This creature had feathers. It looked very much like a bird. It did have a long tail, a bony tail, which no bird today has. It had teeth in its mouth, but it was clear that it flew. It was a good flyer. Its feathers are asymmetric like good flyers are today. So it's clear that this creature was a good flyer. And it's been the subject of controversy through the years. At one time, a couple of scientists suggested that the feathers were carved, that it was really a reptile, but the feathers were carved. But it does have the appearance of what you might expect for an intermediate between birds and reptiles. But that's fine, but how do you get from no feathers to fully formed flight feathers without leaving a fossil record?
Archaeopteryx is an organism, the first really publicly known fossil, really came to light around 1863. And everybody was very excited about it because it's got feathers, and there's no doubt about that, but it also has teeth in its mouth. And it has a long tail. And modern birds have short tails, and modern birds have a beak and no teeth. There are other things. The feathers actually look like the kind of feathers that are used by birds today for flying. So people started looking at this, and even Charles Darwin himself wrote about it in a letter. He called it the Solnhofen creature or bird or something like that. And he said, hey, what do you think of this? Because, of course, his theory had predicted that there would be these intermediate varieties between one group of creatures like dinosaurs and another group of creatures like birds. So it was a pretty exciting thing. And people at the British Museum, particularly the director, his name was Owen, got very excited and actually almost bankrupted, apparently, the museum to buy this Archaeopteryx specimen. We call it today the London specimen of Archaeopteryx. And there was a lot of work done studying this curious creature.
Em um mundo transformado pela recente publicação de A Origem das Espécies em 1859, as enigmáticas características do Archaeopteryx atraíram os olhos de alguns que estavam à procura do tão esperado exemplo, até o momento inexistente, de uma espécie de transição. Neste caso, entre répteis, como por exemplo os dinossauros, e as aves. Será que esta estranha criatura é a prova final necessária para comprovar na prática a teoria da evolução de todas as espécies a partir de um ancestral comum universal?
There was another scientist who lived at the same time named T.H. Huxley. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. He was an avid fan of what Darwin had proposed in Origin of Species. And Huxley hated Owen, always looked for reasons to pick fights with him and to argue with him and disagree with him. And so when Archaeopteryx came out and Owen showed it to the world, Huxley began to notice that the features that distinguished Archaeopteryx from modern birds were actually features that were similar to a dinosaur called Compsognathus. So the claws, the bony tail, the size, the overall anatomical structure, the teeth, they all seem very similar to this other dinosaur, this small dinosaur called Compsognathus. And he was the one then who first proposed, maybe this means that there is an evolutionary relationship.
Probably the first person who really seriously recognized some kind of relationship between birds and dinosaurs was Thomas Henry Huxley. And Huxley realized that there were certain anatomical similarities that you found in dinosaurs' skulls and bird skulls. And then there were some other bits and pieces. For example, some dinosaurs have hips that have the same kind of architecture to them as birds' hips. Now, for better or for worse, it's now thought that birds evolved from the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, but the bird-hipped dinosaurs, they still, might be some kind of indicator. Certainly the arrangement is the same. So it's not unreasonable to conclude that there's more similarities between birds and dinosaurs than between birds and mammals, for example, or snails. They have to be more similar to something. It happens to be dinosaurs.
And so he was the first one to propose that those similarities are probably indications of an evolutionary relationship between birds and dinosaurs. Other scientists weren't so convinced. Big reason was the collarbone. Modern birds have collarbones, and there was no collarbones known from the dinosaurs that were supposed to be connected to the birds, and so there was this skepticism. But with the discovery of these Chinese fossils with these feathers and other what they call Maniraptoran dinosaurs that have these collarbones, then it was decided that, okay, well, maybe this connection is real. And then with the advent of this evolutionary method called cladistics, which looks at shared characteristics, then there was found more and more evidence that these birds and dinosaurs are connected. At least that's what they think.
Nos últimos anos, a província de Liaoning, situada no nordeste da China, se tornou um dos depósitos de fósseis mais famosos do mundo. A qualidade da preservação dos seus restos, a inúmera quantidade de fósseis e a diversidade de novas espécies de dinossauros, mamíferos, aves e plantas encontradas nestas camadas do Mesozoico relatam uma história de abundância e catástrofe. Grandes erupções e inundações resultaram em finas partículas de cinzas e barro, que cobriram rapidamente numerosas formas de vida, selando-as, evitando sua descomposição e preservando-as nos mínimos detalhes.
China has proven to be a remarkable place for finding very detailed fossils. Fossils in which you can see things like internal organs. Sometimes you can see the patterns on organism skin. It's really revolutionized in a lot of ways our understanding of how ancient organisms worked, because you can see things in them that were unimaginable in the past. One of the kinds of fossils that they've been finding are fossils that are interpreted to be dinosaurs but with feathers on their surface. Now, I personally have no problem at all with the idea that dinosaurs could have had feathers. Why not? There's nothing in the Bible that says they couldn't have feathers. We know that they did have scales, many of them, because we have skin impressions. But birds have scales on their legs and things like that as well. So, it just doesn't bother me. I just wanted to know. And so I looked at those fossils. Obviously, I couldn't take them out of the case and look at them under, using a magnifying glass or anything like that. But I must say that I was pretty skeptical about most of the specimens that they were claiming had feathers on them. However, there was at least one specimen that looked like it was possible that it had real, genuine feathers. Since that time, I've actually gone and seen some other other specimens, and at least one of those also looks to me like it may have had fossils on its feathers on its surface. So I would love to know what the reality is. Maybe they did have feathers on their surface, and then you have to ask, well, what were the feathers doing? Were they using them for warmth? Were they brightly colored? Were they decorative in some way? What was going on with them? I'm not totally convinced by what I've seen at this point, but I think it's a possibility.
This is an issue that's very controversial, even among paleontologists that believe that in evolution, because some of them think that birds are a distinct taxon, but many people think that birds and dinosaurs are related, and somehow dinosaurs are surviving today in the form of birds. This is based on similarities between birds and dinosaurs that all of us know about. For example, the leg of a chicken has scales on it, just like a dinosaur skin. And there are certain dinosaurs that may or may not have had feathers on them. And there are certain small flying reptiles, such as Archaeopteryx, that look a lot like birds or seem to be in between birds and reptiles. And I think this is not a settled issue. It's still something that's controversial. One of the problems is that the dinosaurs that are supposed to have given rise to the birds are not found in the fossil record until after the birds. So one could just as easily say the birds gave rise to the dinosaurs, at least that group of dinosaurs, as to say the dinosaurs gave rise to the birds. There are some remains of birds that, although they're controversial, go clear back to the Triassic at the very time the dinosaurs were first found on the Earth. So one could make the case that dinosaurs and birds have been here all through the Mesozoic, and they just aren't preserved as fossils. We know today that birds have very light construction, and if a bird dies, it will float for a long time before anything settles out. So in a global flood, if birds were dying, they probably wouldn't be buried until long after they died. So there are a lot of reasons that this is still controversial. I think many people think it's settled, but there are some paleontologists that still believe that that's not a correct view of birds. And I don't think birds are dinosaurs. I think they are a unique taxon. They're found abundantly in Cretaceous rocks, and they are, although some of them have unique characteristics, some of them had teeth and other features that we don't normally associate with birds, apparently this was just the way they were.
Nowadays, I think it's reasonable to have a little bit of a different view of what Archaeopteryx is. It was interpreted as an intermediate variety. But if you actually look at the pattern in the fossil record, what you see is that it's part of a relatively common pattern. As you come up through the fossil record, dinosaurs, there they are in layers of rock. And then up near the top of the Jurassic layers of rock, there's Archaeopteryx. And actually, over 10 specimens have been found of Archaeopteryx. And then immediately above, in the next layer above, there are lots of birds. And some of those birds have beaks, but a long tail, or a long tail and a beak. Or Archaeopteryx had little fingers on its wings. And some of those birds have little fingers on their wings too. So there's all of these different things. But in addition to that, in the lower Cretaceous layer, you also find modern birds. So what you're seeing that Archaeopteryx is part of is the sudden appearance of a group of organisms without obvious precursors. And when they appear, they are more profoundly different than we see in living organisms today. Today, we don't see birds with long tails. We don't see birds with teeth in their mouths. There's one kind of bird called a hoatzin that when it's a chick, it does crawl around using sort of a claw thing on its wings. But generally speaking, we don't see that sort of thing in modern birds. Apparently in the past, it's not just that there were a lot of different species of birds, they were really different from each other. Whereas today we have one kind of bird, but lots of different species based on that general plan.
Compreender a diversidade de espécies em um tempo que tão somente as conhecemos por partes exige estarmos dispostos a reconhecer que o que sabemos não é mais do que uma fração. E ao tentar interpretar os dados apenas segundo o que aceitamos e submeter os resultados unicamente às estruturas que construímos, poderemos talvez nos aproximar em parte a um conhecimento, mas arriscando que nos afastemos de tudo o que estes realmente nos revelam sobre sua verdadeira origem.
For an evolutionary biologist, the way you study the relationships of organisms is by putting things onto an evolutionary tree. And so when an evolutionist goes in and collects information about organisms, especially fossil critters, they're going to essentially try to find the best tree that they can find to fit those characteristics of those animals or those plants or whatever they are. There really isn't any sense in the evolutionary world of whether those things belong on the same evolutionary tree. There really isn't any tool available in evolutionary science to do that. And so that was what I was interested in doing. What would I do if I wanted to test whether things should go together on the same evolutionary tree? And so I worked out a system together with a number of different colleagues, trying to use what we call multivariate statistics and clustering analysis in order to figure out, okay, given these sets of characteristics, do we have a single cluster here that represents perhaps a lineage that is related, or do we have lots of different clusters which represent something that's very different and unrelated? For example, cats. Cats, there's no doubt in my mind that lions and tigers and ocelots and all those things go back to a common ancestral stock that God created. But cats and dogs are distinct and they are recognizably different. And I can do that statistically. It's not just something where I can say they look different. I can find those differences in the actual data. So that was my interest in this whole issue. I was dragged into the dinosaur issue, let's put it that way. Research that I had been doing on other organisms, horses and mammals mostly, was applied to dinosaurs by a dinosaur researcher named Phil Center. His expertise is the bird-dinosaur connection. So he studies this whole thing and is one of the world experts on that. And he went on this little spree for a while writing papers against creationists, writing arguments against them. And so he wrote this paper using the kind of research that I was doing and applying that to dinosaurs and arguing that my conclusions were wrong and that dinosaurs evolved from birds. And so that led me to do my own work on the dinosaur issue, and two papers followed from that, one in the Journal of Evolutionary Biology and one in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creationism, all of which found significant differences between birds and dinosaurs, even within the original Maniraptoran dinosaurs that are supposed to be the bird ancestors and the earliest birds like Archaeopteryx. So it wasn't simply a matter of, a flamingo is different from a T-Rex. That's kind of obvious. I could have told you that. But going back to those original dinosaurs where you have these rather striking anatomical similarities, it's still not enough to suggest a single evolving lineage. There seem to be significant differences between the different groups of dinosaurs that I was looking at.
Diferenças que na caracterização distanciam, semelhanças que na classificação aproximam. Atributos compartilhados que para alguns evidenciam um parentesco, enquanto para outros são a marca de um desenhista.
First of all, realize that scientists who talk about this are not asking, did birds get created or did they evolve? They're working in a theory that does not accept any kind of creation. It is committed to the idea that everything is a result of evolution. And so what they're asking is, what is the most likely creature that birds could evolve from? When God designed creatures, He made reptiles and birds with a similar skeletal plan. They have some bones that mammals don't have, for instance. And so if you're looking for where could birds have evolved from, your most likely possibility is going to be from reptiles. And there are some small dinosaurs that have skeletons that are fairly similar to the Cretaceous bird fossils. And so, since you're only asking what are the most likely ancestors of birds, then you would say, okay, that must be, these small dinosaurs must be the ancestors. If you're asking that broader question, did birds evolve or were they created? Then you're open to consider different options. Just because birds have some bones that reptiles have, you don't have to decide that they evolved from reptiles. That's beside the point.
A origem das aves, suas maravilhosas e diversas plumagens, seu comportamento individual e coletivo e suas extraordinárias características físicas que permitem que cumpram com destreza a complexa façanha de voar, continuam sendo um grande enigma para a ciência. Pode tanta complexidade, organismos com tanta interdependência serem o resultado unicamente de milhares de combinações por tentativa e erro? Podem apenas a seleção natural e as mutações conseguir que um dinossauro evolua até se transformar em uma ave? Poderia esta grande mudança acontecer sem deixar claras evidências gravadas no registro fóssil?